Well, good morning. We are in week 3 of a series that we're simply calling A Generous Life. And we're spending a lot of time unpacking what generosity is and what it isn't. The truth is I think if we get this right, it sets our lives on a different kind of course. And so my hope is that over the last 2 weeks, you've been wrestling and thinking about what generosity looks like in your own life. And the thing that we keep coming back to is that it is mindset, not money. Everyone say that with me, mindset, not money. Okay, this isn't about giving financially. This isn't about emptying your bank accounts. This isn't about some sort of weird prosperity gospel that says if you give us a ton of money, you'll find money in an envelope in the front of your door or anything like that. This is about the mindset in which we live life and about the generous God who has given us life. And I didn't get permission to do this, so I'll ask for forgiveness instead of permission. But can I just tell you a little bit about the generosity of God? Can I tell you about what God is doing in the life of Mary Kovalt? Mary was diagnosed with cancer and has had some rough days. And she had a procedure a few weeks ago, actually probably a couple weeks ago now maybe. Maybe it was last week. My goodness, time is moving so slow. It was last week. And she got results from the procedure, and the results let her know that she is cancer-free. And when we see that, we can see the generosity of God, okay? But what I want to share with you today is that when I see the life of someone like Mary and I see the generosity of God, I also think about all the people with cancer diagnoses that it's not gone. And some of you may even be in the room. And the question becomes, is God still generous when that's not the results of the test? Is God still generous when the things I want in my life don't turn out the way I'd hoped? Is God still generous even when I struggle to be grateful? Because if I'm being honest with you this morning, if I can be completely transparent with you, I'm not as grateful as I should be for the things I have in my life. I don't know if any of you can relate to that. But I'm not as grateful as I should be. I feel sometimes like I deserve things I don't have. I feel sometimes like things aren't as smooth as they should be. I don't know if you ever feel that way. Like, hey, God, if I'm doing everything right, I mean, I'm a pastor, right? So my life should be extra, like, good. Like, my life should be way better than all of yours, okay? Yeah, right. But I look at my life and I start to think to myself, why am I so ungrateful? Why is it that when I look at my life and I look at my wonderful family and I look at my home and I look at what I get to do for the Lord, why do I struggle with gratitude and gratefulness? I believe I fall into something that a lot of us fall into that I'm simply just going to call the comparison trap. That when I look at my life and I look at what God has done for me, it's great. But when I start looking at what God is doing for you, I'm a little jealous. When I start looking at how God shows up in the life of someone else, I start to go, well, where's my portion? Why didn't I get some of that? Do you know that all of you look perfect on Facebook? All of you. You're all perfect. And you go on these amazing family trips, and you love your kids more than I love mine. And your jobs are just phenomenal. And you're all so beautiful. You know? You're all so beautiful. Doesn't it feel that way when you look at Facebook? Doesn't it feel like everyone's got their stuff figured out? So like, I'm watching, I was at the Fall Festival yesterday out at Fort Laramie. Did I say that right? Laramie? Okay, thanks guys. I'm still new. So I'm out at this Fall Festival, right? And I run into Nick and McKenna Gibson. And with little baby Rory, and we're just like talking and laughing. And then I go over, and my son wants to go over to this wilderness area where they're pretending that they're all homeless and they have little tents and pots and pans or whatever. He wants to go do that, so my wife takes him over there. I don't want to go, so I'm just chilling on my phone, sitting in the beer tent. Not even, I'm drinking water, guys, but it was the only tent I could find. So I'm sitting in the beer tent, texting on my phone, and I look over and I see Nick throwing Rory up in the air and catching her. And I'm like, oh. And then I watch, and Rory's giggling and laughing, and I'm like, he's a way better dad than I am. You know, you look at the life of other people and you start to go, I don't measure up, okay? I don't measure up. So I'm grateful for my family, but I wish I had your family. I'm grateful for my income, but I wish I had your income. I'm grateful that I'm healthy, but I wish I looked as good as you do. That's what happens is we get stuck in this trap. And it's the trap of comparison. We do it online through social media. We do it face-to-face at church. Because I don't know if you know this, but some of the people who you may admire are a mess. But when they walk into this church, you'd never know it. And I'm not keeping a list. But there are people here who you may look at, man, if I wish I was just as godly as that person, and they're cheating on their wives. And you don't even know. So let's be real. We do it at church. We do it online. We do it at work with the people who seem to have better positions than we have. We do it inside of our family, right? We have a sibling or an uncle or an aunt or a dad or whatever the case may be where it just seems like they live a better life. But here's the problem with the comparison trap. The problem with the comparison trap is we cannot look at the best of others and compare it to the reality of our own life. Do you see how that's a trap? We're looking at, nobody posts, got into a fight with my wife this morning. Right? They post the date night picture right before it all went wrong. Am I right? We cannot compare our personal reality to the best of what someone else wants to put out there. It'll never work, and we'll never be grateful for what we have. Our real and their best will never match up. It's a trap. And it's a trap that keeps us struggling with gratitude. And it's because of this that we can't receive the generosity of God in our lives if we are looking at what God is doing for others with envy. If you're here this morning and you just heard me say that Mary Kovalt is cancer-free and you are struggling with cancer, you run the risk of not being able to accept God's generosity in your life because you're too envious of the news of someone else. And that's not just that situation, that's every situation. We can't receive the generosity of God in our lives if we are looking at what God is doing in the life of others with envy. It's a trap. And it will eat you up. And you'll never be okay. Let me tell you about somebody that no one was envious of. His name is Matthew. Nobody is envious of Matthew. Imagine this. Imagine being Jewish and making a decision that you're no longer going to identify as simply Jewish. You're going to attach yourselves to your brand new employer called the Roman Empire. Imagine. These Romans, they come in to Jerusalem and to surrounding cities throughout Israel, and they come in and they take over. And Matthew takes it as an opportunity to be a tax collector and collect money from his own people. And here's the crazy part. The Romans would let Matthew know how much he needed to collect, and this was all tax collectors. The Romans would say, hey, we need the equivalent of $5,000, let's just say. And Matthew would sit in a little booth, and people would come up to pay their taxes, and he would say, the Romans require $7,500. Because when you were a tax collector, you could charge whatever you wanted, as long as Rome got their share. Matthew was wealthy. He was lonely. And everywhere he went, he had to fear for his life. Because the equivalent of Matthew as a tax collector in our society is not someone working for the IRS. The equivalent of someone like Matthew as a tax collector in our society would be someone who sexually abuses children. Don't miss it. People actively were hunting him. He chose Rome. And he chose Rome in a really strange season. See, from the beginning, when God brought Israel into the promised land, God assigned everyone land, right? The 12 tribes all had their own pieces of land in the promised land, and that belonged to them. And God said, it belongs to you, kind of. It actually belongs all to me, but I'm giving it to you. And here's how we're going to figure this out. On every 7th year, you're not going to farm the land. You're just going to eat your leftovers from the 6 years prior so that you can be reminded that the land is not yours, it's mine. Oh, and by the way, after we do 7 years, 7 times, which is 49 years, we're going to do something called the Year of Jubilee. And if over that 49 years you had to sell your land to pay off somebody, you hired a slave to help work the land, anything you did where it looked like you were in charge of the land, every 49 years we reset back to the way I had it in the beginning. Slaves are set free, land goes back to their original owner, everything starts over because it's not yours, it's mine. You see that? So what's really cool is when the Roman Empire came in, they were like, we're totally fine with that. No. The Roman Empire came in and said, we don't know your God, and let us help you. The land is still not yours, it's ours. The Greek Empire said it before them. The land is not yours, it's ours. So as Matthew is collecting taxes, what happens is we reach a point where some people don't have enough money to make Matthew happy. And they reach a place where all they have left is their land. And the Roman Empire says, we're totally fine with that. You don't have to pay us this time. We're taking our land back. And people began to lose their farmland and began to live closer and closer into these cities where they were sharing from each other and figuring out how to make it work because they were no longer landowners. And this is where we find ourselves in the 1st century. People who were promised land by God without land, who worked the land as their profession, now looking for work. And Matthew, skimming off the top, making sure that his house is big and full and looks really good on Facebook. And then Jesus came. And he looked at this tax collector who was hated by everyone, and he said, "Come follow me." And Matthew did. He left everything, all the good and the bad, and he followed hard after Jesus. And I am so grateful that he did. And let me tell you why. Because if you're a tax collector, you're a good record keeper. And if you're a good record keeper, I want to read your gospel of the account of the life of Jesus. There's a reason why Matthew's gospel in chapter 1 starts with the lineage of Jesus from Abraham all the way to Jesus, because Matthew is keeping record. He's keeping a ledger of who Jesus is. So today, we're going to journey into the book of Matthew, to a story that Jesus told. And when we talk about stories that Jesus told, we're talking about fictional events that Jesus would share that we would call parables. And these parables are stories that have a purpose. And in Matthew chapter 19, he ends up in a true conversation with a rich man. And the rich man is like, how do I get to heaven? And Matthew looks at him Jesus looks at him and says, this is how you get to heaven. Sell everything you got. And it says the rich man went away sad because he wasn't going to do it. And then Jesus begins to share a story with the disciples and the Pharisees and the people of the community who are all there. He begins to share a story about how hard it is for a rich man to get into heaven. And he uses the phrase, it's easier for a camel to fit through the eye of a needle than for a rich man to enter the kingdom of heaven. What's impossible, God can make possible. And then if you turn the page or go straight to the next chapter, in Matthew chapter 20, what we see is Jesus telling a parable about the kingdom of heaven. So he has this conversation about how hard it is to get in it, and then he says, the kingdom of heaven is like. So, Matthew chapter 20, starting at verse 1, it says this, for the kingdom of heaven is like a landowner who went out early in the morning to hire workers for his vineyard. Okay, it's early in the morning. This guy owns a lot of land, and there's people who are in need of work. Why are they in need of work? Because they have no land. They need a job. They've got to take care of their family somehow. So this vineyard worker, this landowner goes out to look for vineyard workers, and he agreed to pay them a denarius for the day and sent them into his vineyard. So he grabs a bunch of them really early in the morning, sunrise during this period, just to let you know where we are. The picking season for vineyards in Israel is between August and October, okay? So right now. All right? What we know is that we're going to find out really quickly that this vineyard owner is grabbing as many workers as he can, which would say that we're at the end of the picking season. Are you with me? Because he's trying to finish up before the weather changes. So we know that he's probably sometime in October. So just to help you what early morning looked like, what I think when I think of early morning is right before the sun comes up. Or right as the sun's coming up. We're talking early morning. So, the sun rises October 1st, last year in Israel, at 6:27 a.m., just so you know. So we're talking about 6 o'clock in the morning. This vineyard owner shows up. He goes to these workers. He says, I'm going to give you a denarius if you'll come. And they say, sure. A denarius. A Roman coin. On the front of the Roman coin would have been the emperor at the time. On the back of the Roman coin would have been probably Augustus himself as a former emperor in honor of him. Some people believe it was a woman sitting in a chair, which is Tiberius' mother, because on the front would have been Tiberius. But anyway, it's a silver coin, and that coin represents 1 day's work. Okay? The idea was that a denarius covered you and your family for 1 day. It was called also a soldier's wage. That if you were a soldier in the Roman army, you were given 1 denarius for each day because that covered your family. So what this owner said to these workers was, hey, listen, it's early in the morning. I got work for you for the whole day. If you'll come with me, I got your family today. It's a pretty good deal if you're going to work for a day and get paid to cover your family for a day. That's not unfair. Makes sense to me. So that's what happened. And then it says he went back at 9 a.m. and he did the exact same thing. Kind of. Listen to what he says to the 9 a.m. group. He told them, "You also go and work in my vineyard, and I will pay you whatever is right." So they went. Isn't that interesting? The first workers get a denarius. The second workers get what is right. Now, I don't know if your 21st century American mind works like mine, but when I read they'll get what is right, my brain says they'll get what is fair. Any of you do the same thing? It's fair. Okay, so if the people started first and they got a denarius, and then 3 hours later he comes back, it's probably going to be about 3/4 of a denarius. Who knows what coin that is? And they're going to be working something like that. So he says, "I'll give you what is right." The weird part is when you look up the word right in its original form, what you'll find is it doesn't mean fair. It doesn't mean equal. It doesn't mean appropriate. It means righteous. Of God. I mean, imagine this. The first people get a day's wage. The second group of people he calls get what God believes they deserve. Not fair, righteous. It's going to become an important distinction as we move forward. Why? Because right and fair are not the same thing. What's right of God and what's fair are not always the same thing. So what's happening? What's happening is Jesus is telling a story, and he's saying, "Let me explain to you how the kingdom of God works." We draw people into work to be a part of what's happening. And we're righteous. We're righteous. And for the rest of this section, you get to find out what God thinks is right. And that's why it should matter. So he goes back at noon and he gets more workers and he tells them the same thing. He goes back at 3, he gets more workers. He tells them the same thing. And then he goes back at 5. October 1st, 2021. The sun set in Israel at 6:28. He goes back at 5 p.m. and there's a group of guys still standing there. Now, these must not be good workers. Can we be honest? I mean, let's be real. These fellas didn't look at each other at 4 o'clock and say, "Well, no one's clearly going to hire us. There's some things I can do at home." They also weren't chosen of all the vineyard owners who may have come and gathered some workers. They're just there with no money, wondering as the sun's setting, "You think anybody's coming?" So at the end of verse 6, the vineyard worker says, "Why have you been standing here all day long doing nothing?" It's a great question. I bet their wives are super happy with them right now. Okay? "Why have you been standing here all day doing nothing?" And their answer, "Because no one hired us." Because no one hired us, they answered. He said to them, "You also go work in my vineyard." So let's make some assumptions. Let's assume it was 30 minutes to the vineyard from the middle of town, what's called the Agora or the marketplace. Let's assume it's 30 minutes out. So he has this conversation with them at 5. They jump in at like 5:10. They take a 30-minute drive out, 5:40. Then when they get there, the owner looks at them and says, "Okay, here's what I need you to do, and here's where we are in the process. This is the part of the field I need you to go to." So they head on out to that part of the field, and then they begin to work, and right as they start picking their first grapes, well, looks like the sun's going down. And they take their baskets with maybe 6 grapes in them. Back up. "Thanks for hiring us." I mean, that's basically what happened. They were there for probably an hour max. And now all of a sudden it's over. The day is over. But at least they're going to get something. Because the owner said he would make it right. In verse 8 of chapter 20, when evening came, the owner of the vineyard said to his foreman, "Call the workers and pay them their wages, beginning with the last ones hired and going on to the first." So let's take a look at these times again. We have the early morning workers. We have workers at 9 a.m. We have workers who came at noon. We have a group of workers who came at 3. And then we have the fellows who never left the marketplace just wondering if somebody would hire them, who came around 5. And after this long, hot day in the Middle East, the vineyard owner says, check this out, the ones who got here first, let's make them wait. Isn't that interesting? Those guys have been there since like 5:30, 6 o'clock in the morning, and the owner is saying they can wait for their pay last. Well, just having to wait would annoy me after that long of a day. I want to go home. I want to take my denarius. I want to go home. I want to take care of my family for dinner. Please let me go. And what the owner says is, you can wait. So they stand in line. I just can't imagine this picture. They stand in line, and the 5 o'clock workers come up with their little tiny baskets of grapes. And the person working for the vineyard, for the landowner, says, "Thank you for your time. Here's a denarius." And they probably all looked at each other and went, maybe he thinks we're the ones who got here first. Thank you. And they scurry away. And then the next group comes up. And it's these like 3 o'clock afternoon workers. "Thanks for your time. Here's a denarius." And they probably thought to themselves, well, that's not right. But hey, we didn't think we were going to get that. So they scurry off. Then the noon workers come. "Thanks for your time. Here's a denarius." And they probably thought, figures, we should have got more. I mean, we were here since noon. And they move away. And then here comes those 9 o'clock workers, and then eventually those early morning workers. And you got to be thinking, as an early morning worker, you know you're getting the bonus. Right? Like, this is all set up to go, and for you, here's 3 denarius, right? Or whatever, denarii, or whatever it is. And so they're just kind of waiting, right? So they received their denarius. And in verse 11, it says this: when they received it, they began to grumble against the landowner. And if you don't know what that actually means, what it means is they're contemplating what they're going to do to him. It's not, hey, that's not fair. It's, should we beat him up, or should we kill him, or like, should we like get a riot out here because this guy's crazy? They're grumbling against him, and it says they were grumbling against the landowners. These who were hired last worked only 1 hour, they said. And you made them equal to us, who have borne the burden of the work in the heat of the day. But the landowner responded, but he answered one of them, "I am not being unfair to you, friend. Didn't you agree to work for a denarius?" Like, wait a minute. When I picked you up and I gave you work for the day, and I told you what you would make, you jumped in the back of the truck pretty quick. These early morning workers had fallen into something called a comparison trap, haven't they? See, I'm being paid what is fair and what I said is okay, but when I look at what other people get, it's not right. And the response of the landowner is to call them friend and to remind them that he is not being unfair. The mission of God is not to be fair. Church, family. The mission of God is not to be fair. In fact, what I would tell you is that if the goal is fairness, we are headed to hell. If the goal of God is just to give us what we deserve, if the goal of God is to simply be fair and to make sure that we get what we're worth and we get the equivalent of what we've accomplished, we are all doomed for hell. So what do we deserve? You know, if I'm working for the vineyard, what is the wage that I deserve? Well, Paul makes it very clear when he says, the wages of sin is what? For the wages of sin is death, but the gift of God, it's a gift. Whoa, you deserve death. I deserve death. But the gift, the generous gift of God is that although we deserve death, which is fair, he wants us to have what is righteous. The gift of God is eternal life, not through our own work, but in Jesus Christ our Lord. Many times I've read over this story, and I remember in first readings of this story of the parable of the vineyard workers, I would get to the place where I would say to myself things like, you know, this is the story where I kind of fit as an early worker. I fit as an early worker because I've been trying to live my life for Jesus since I was young. And these people on their deathbeds, they show up, Jesus enter my heart, they die and they're in. That's not fair. Here I am trying to figure out what it means to live a life where I don't sin, where I live holy. And these people on their deathbeds can just go, Jesus, save me, and then poof, they're in. That is not fair. But let me help you in a way that helped me. There's a group of people who God ordained to be a priestly nation for the Gentiles. We call them Israelites, the people of Israel. From the beginning, they've been journeying with God. From the beginning, they've been trying to wrestle out what it means to follow him. They've been working on this generation after generation after generation. Some good years and good seasons, some rough seasons, but they've been with him trying to figure this out from the beginning. So, if you can hear my voice and you're not Jewish, everyone's thinking about you right now. You know that, right? Okay. If you can hear my voice and you're not Jewish, let me help you. We are the 5 o'clock workers. All of us. We are the ones who showed up late. We are the ones, and that's not because of God, that's because of man. We have shown up late as Gentiles. We have shown up late to the game. We are the 5 o'clock workers who get the gift of God that is the same as those who got it in the beginning. Paul says it this way, we're grafted into the family of Abraham. We are the 5 o'clock workers. And I'll tell you, when I found myself being a 5 o'clock worker instead of an early morning worker, the story changed as I read it. So now that you know you're 5 o'clock workers, let's read the rest of this story, starting in verse 14. He tells the early morning workers, take your pay and go. I want to give the one who was hired last the same as I'm giving you. And don't I have a right to do what I want with my own money, or are you envious because I'm generous? Aren't you grateful for a God who looks at the people of Israel in all love and says, I want to give them what I gave you? And since it's all mine anyway, are you just jealous because of how generous I am? For the wages of sin is death, but the gift of God is eternal life to all 5 o'clock workers in this room. He finishes up with this statement: so the last will be first, and the first will be last. Which is exactly how he finished the conversation about the rich person who needed to sell everything. It's harder for a camel to get through the eye of the needle because the last will be first, and the first will be last. So imagine a line of people, and the first person in line is the most wealthy. And they step to the back. And then the next person steps to the back. And what happens is the people who were first are now all last. And the people who were last begin to step up. And what you end up with, if you follow that train, what you end up with is not a line that goes this way, but a line that goes this way. If the first people in the line step back and the last people in the line step up, the line becomes horizontal, not vertical. And what we end up with is a kingdom of God where everyone is equal who calls on the name of the Lord. The last become all first, and the first become all last. And in the end, there's balance and equality. So what do we do now? See, what I'm trying to explain to you is that if we want to live a generous life, we have to learn to be grateful for the God who gave it to us. We have to learn to not look at the people around us and be distracted. So here are 3 things that I'd like you to consider as you leave today about how you can live a more generous life. Number 1, I want you to acknowledge what distracts you. I want you to acknowledge the people, the things, the stories, the pay. I want you to acknowledge what distracts you. What are the things in your life that keep you from seeing God's generous hand on you specifically? If your sentence about generosity starts with the phrase, yeah, but, whatever comes next is your distraction. I love my family. Yeah, we have all we need, but so-and-so has so much more. That's your distraction. You need to acknowledge what distracts you. Number 2, I'm going to ask you to celebrate what God is doing in others until you mean it. You caught that, right? Celebrate what God is doing in others until you mean it. See the generosity of God in other people and do not compare it to your own. I'm so happy that happened for you. Maybe there's somebody who, over the course of your life, you've compared yourself to. Because they have ... and I wish I had ... Whatever that may be, start to celebrate them, even though they may not need it. You need it. We all have people in our life that we kind of measure ourselves against. Let's be honest. Celebrate them. Don't look for the holes. Okay? Another way I would put that is it's time for you to adjust your attitude. It's that simple. It's time for an attitude adjustment. It's no longer about others. It's about you and it's about the Father. That's it. Adjust your attitude. And lastly, number 3. respond to God's generosity with your own. If you know God is generous and you know you struggle to see it, become more generous. I mean, that doesn't have to be at connection point, folks. It can be, but it doesn't have to be. Become more generous. Be more giving. I told you that I struggle with gratitude, right? And I struggle with generosity myself. So I've created all of these little things that I like fail safes so that I'll be a more generous person. Okay? One of those is, you ever go to like one of those drive-thrus and there's 2 lines, right? And sometimes you pick the right line and you get in front of the car that was actually in front of you. You know what I'm talking about? Every time I do that, I pay for the car I cut. Every time I do that, I pay for the car I cut. Because if I don't, I'll just be like, ha. So it's something inside of me that keeps me being relatively generous, okay? If I'm in line to get coffee and I find myself looking in my rearview mirror more than twice at the car behind me just to see what they're doing. Sometimes they're on the phone, they're checking their makeup, or they're flipping with the radio or whatever. If I look at them more than twice, I pay for their coffee. Okay? So all these little things that I do because I'm not naturally generous. Is it okay that I say that? All right. So what I have to do to be a generous person is I have to create little games that I play that force generosity out of me because it doesn't come naturally. So I can pray for the next 20, 30 years, God, why make me more generous? Or I can just start doing it even though I'm not feeling it. Sometime we just have to decide that God's generosity is enough for us to be generous. And it doesn't have to be at a certain dollar amount or anything like that. Your generosity could be $2. But I'll tell you what, if that comes from a deep place, it is a response to God's generosity in your life, and He'll do amazing things with it. You want to lean into the generosity of God? Do it with your own. Bottom line this morning is this: God's generosity leads to our generosity when we live with gratitude, undistracted. When we become grateful people, undistracted by the people around us, God's generosity comes alive in our lives. And the people around us stop seeing us and they start seeing Him, because He wants to move in and through us.